April 23, 1945, near the town of Grafenwöhr in Bavaria. The morning sun broke through sheets of rain that had turned the roads into rivers of mud, and Helga Schneider hunched over her telegraph machine in a bunker that smelled of damp earth and May oil lamps, transcribing orders that made less sense with each passing hour. She was 23 years old, a communications auxiliary, who had spent 3 years believing that her work connected her to something greater than herself, to a cause that would reshape the world. She could not have known that within 6 hours, everything she had been taught to believe about enemies, about race, about the very nature of humanity itself, would be proven so catastrophically wrong that she would spend the rest of her life trying to reconcile the woman she had been that morning with the woman she would become by nightfall. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how a group of German women, captured as the war collapsed around them, came face to face with the soldiers they had been taught to fear most, and discovered that the monster existed not in the men standing before them, but in the lies they had been fed for years. It is a story about the moment when propaganda meets reality, when hatred confronts humanity, and when the carefully constructed walls of prejudice crumble under the weight of simple human decency. Helga had joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps in 1942, when she was 20 years old, and the world still seemed full of certainty. Her father had been a postal clerk in Munich, her mother a seamstress, and they had raised her to be obedient, dutiful, and proud of her heritage. When the recruitment officers came to her neighborhood, speaking of service and sacrifice, of the vital role women could play in supporting the troops, she had signed up with the enthusiasm of someone who believed that history was being made and she could be part of it. They trained her in Morse code and radio operation, in the handling of classified communications and the maintenance of telegraph equipment. She became proficient, even skilled, her fingers flying over the keys with a speed that impressed her supervisors. For 3 years, she had worked in various communications centers, moving westward as the fronts shifted, always believing what she was told about the righteousness of the cause, about the enemies who sought to destroy everything she held dear. The broadcasts had been constant, the messages clear. The enemy consisted of barbaric hordes, especially the troops from across the ocean, and particularly those of African descent, who were portrayed as savage, violent, less than human. She had absorbed these messages without question, the way one absorbs the air one breathes, never thinking to examine their truth, because everyone around her accepted them as fact. Now in the spring of 1945, with the sound of artillery growing closer each day, those certainties were beginning to crack. The orders she transcribed made increasingly less sense. Units that no longer existed were being commanded to positions they could never reach. Supply requests went unanswered. Communications became sporadic, chaotic, and yet the officers in the bunker continued to speak with confidence about ultimate victory, about wonder weapons that would turn the tide, about the enemy's imminent collapse. Helga wanted to believe them. She needed to believe them. The alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. The other women in the bunker shared her uncertainty, though they rarely spoke of it directly. There was Margaret Hoffman, 31 years old, who had worked as a teacher before the war and now managed the filing systems for the communications center. She was tall and thin, with prematurely grey hair that she kept pinned severely back, and she had a habit of humming quietly to herself when she worked, the same 3 notes over and over, a nervous tic that had grown more pronounced in recent weeks. There was Frieda Koch, barely 19, who had joined just 8 months earlier with stars in her eyes and patriotic slogans on her lips, and who now looked perpetually exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, her hands trembling slightly whenever the artillery thundered in the distance. There was also Anneliese Weber, 27, who had lost her husband on the Eastern Front 2 years earlier and wore her grief like a heavy coat she could never remove. She spoke rarely, moved through her duties with mechanical precision, and sometimes late at night when she thought no one was watching, she would take out a photograph from her breast pocket and stare at it for long minutes, her lips moving in silent conversation with someone who could no longer answer. And there was Brigitte Meyer, 25, who had grown up in Berlin and maintained a brittle cheerfulness that seemed increasingly forced, making jokes that no one found funny, talking too much and too fast about anything except what was really happening. They had been together for 6 months, this small group, and they had developed the careful camaraderie of people who must work in close quarters but dare not become too close, too honest with one another. To speak openly about their doubts would be to acknowledge them, and acknowledgement would require action, decisions, consequences they were not prepared to face. So they worked and waited, and pretended that the world was not ending around them. On that morning of April 23rd, Helga arrived at her post at 0600 hours, as she did every morning, climbing down the wooden ladder into the bunker that had been dug into a hillside, 3 kilometers from the nearest town. The bunker was roughly 12 meters long and 4 meters wide, reinforced with timber beams that creaked ominously whenever heavy vehicles passed on the road above. There were 3 telegraph stations, 2 radio sets, and a telephone switchboard that connected to a network that was increasingly spotty and unreliable. The walls were bare earth, shored up with planks, and the floor was dirt that turned to mud whenever water seeped in, which it did with increasing frequency. The officer in charge was Hauptmann Werner Kraus, a man in his late 40s who had been recalled from retirement because so many younger officers were needed at the front. He had spent most of his career in administrative positions, and he approached the chaos of those final weeks with a bureaucrat's insistence on proper procedure. Even as the world collapsed, he required reports to be filed in triplicate, communications to be logged with precise timestamps, and regulations to be followed to the letter. It would have been comical if it had not been so tragic. That morning, Kraus briefed them with his usual attention to detail, outlining the communications schedule, the encryption protocols, the priority levels for different types of messages. He spoke for 15 minutes, and not once did he acknowledge the reality that everyone in the bunker knew but dared not say aloud. They were running out of time. The American forces were less than 30 kilometers away, advancing rapidly, and there was no longer any meaningful defense being mounted. The question was not whether they would be overrun, but when. Helga settled at her telegraph station and began the morning's work. The messages came in sporadic bursts, often garbled, frequently incomplete. She transcribed them mechanically, her training overriding her growing sense of futility. A request for ammunition from a unit that had been destroyed 3 days earlier, an order to hold a position that had already been abandoned, a report about casualties that were no longer being treated because there were no more medical supplies. Each message was a small piece of a larger picture of disintegration, of an army and a system that had run out of everything except empty words. Around 1100 hours the electricity failed. This was not unusual. The power had been intermittent for weeks, but this time it did not come back on. The emergency generator sputtered to life, providing enough power for 1 telegraph station and minimal lighting, and they continued to work in the dimness, the air growing stale and heavy with the smell of too many people in too small a space. At 1300 hours, they heard the first sounds of vehicles on the road above. Heavy vehicles, many of them, moving fast. Kraus climbed the ladder to investigate and returned 15 minutes later, his face ashen. The army was retreating, he said. All units were pulling back to new positions. They would continue operations here until ordered to relocate. No one asked what new positions he meant, or when such orders might come. They already knew there were no positions left to fall back to. They worked through the afternoon in tense silence, broken only by the clatter of the telegraph keys and the periodic rumble of artillery that grew steadily closer. Around 1600 hours, Margaret suddenly stopped her humming and looked up, her head cocked to one side. "Listen," she said. They all stopped and listened. The artillery had ceased. The silence was profound, almost painful after weeks of constant background thunder. Kraus told them it was probably just a temporary lull, a shifting of positions, nothing to worry about. But his voice lacked conviction and no one believed him. At 1700 hours, they heard different sounds. Voices outside shouting in a language that was not German. The sharp crack of rifle fire, but distant, not directed at them. More voices, closer now. Kraus ordered them to destroy all classified documents. They worked quickly, feeding papers into a small stove. But there were too many documents and too little time. The voices grew louder, And then there were footsteps above, heavy boots on the wooden planks that covered the bunker entrance. A voice called down in heavily accented German, "Come out, hands visible, no weapons. You will not be harmed." Kraus looked at the 5 women, and something in his face softened. "You will surrender," he said quietly. "I will go first and explain the situation. You are non-combatants. They will treat you according to the conventions." He spoke as if repeating something he had memorized but did not quite believe. Then he climbed the ladder, his hands raised above his head, and disappeared into the afternoon light. The women looked at each other. Frida was crying silently, tears streaming down her face. Annalisa stood motionless, her hand over the breast pocket that held her husband's photograph. Brigitte's brittle cheerfulness had finally shattered, and she was breathing in short, shallow gasps that suggested she was on the verge of panic. Margaret took Helga's hand and squeezed it once, hard, and then released it. They heard voices above, a conversation in English, Kraus attempting to explain something in his limited command of the language. Then the voice called down again, "Women, come up now, slowly. Hands where we can see them." Helga went first, her legs shaking as she climbed the ladder. She emerged into the late afternoon sunlight, blinking against the brightness after hours in the dim bunker, and found herself surrounded by soldiers in uniforms she recognized from training materials as American. There were perhaps a dozen of them, their weapons pointed at the ground but ready, their expressions alert but not hostile. Kraus stood to one side, his hands on his head, guarded by 2 soldiers, and then Helga saw something that made her breath catch in her throat, that made her mind struggle to process what her eyes were reporting. The soldiers were black, every single one of them. This was the first detail she registered, even before noting their weapons or their insignia or their positions. They were black, and they were looking at her not with the savage violence she had been taught to expect, but with a kind of professional wariness, the expression of soldiers doing their job, securing a position, taking prisoners. The other women emerged from the bunker behind her, and she heard Frida gasp, heard Brigitte make a small, choked sound. They had all seen what she had seen. They were face to face with the enemy they had been taught to fear most, the soldiers who were supposed to be brutal, savage, less than human. And those soldiers were standing there, disciplined and calm, their weapons lowered, waiting. One of the soldiers, a sergeant by his stripes, stepped forward. He was a man of perhaps 30 years, with a weathered face and steady eyes, and he spoke in that same heavily accented German. "You are prisoners of war," he said. "You will be searched for weapons and then transported to a processing center. If you cooperate, you will not be harmed. Do you understand?" Helga found herself nodding, though her mind was still reeling. The sergeant gestured to 2 other soldiers, who approached carefully and conducted quick, professional searches, their hands impersonal and efficient. They found no weapons, none of the women had ever carried weapons, and the sergeant nodded, apparently satisfied. 2 soldiers brought a truck up, and they were told to climb into the back. As they climbed aboard, Helga found herself looking at the faces of their captors, really looking at them for the first time. They were tired, these soldiers, dust-covered and worn from what had clearly been days or weeks of constant movement. Some of them were young, barely older than Frida. Others showed the marks of longer service, the lines around their eyes, the way they held themselves with the economy of movement that comes from experience. They looked, she realized with a shock that felt almost physical, like soldiers. Just soldiers. Men doing a job, far from home, probably as tired and scared as she was. The truck ride lasted perhaps 40 minutes, following roads clogged with refugees and retreating troops. Helga sat in the back with the other women and Kraus, guarded by 2 soldiers who sat across from them, their rifles held loosely across their laps. None of the prisoners spoke. What was there to say? The world they had known had ended, and they were moving into unknown territory, both literally and figuratively. The processing center turned out to be a large farm complex that had been commandeered and converted into a temporary holding facility. There were already dozens of prisoners there, perhaps more than 100, mostly men but some women as well. They were herded into a large barn where they were registered, their names and units recorded by a translator working with an American lieutenant. The process was efficient and impersonal. They were given water, told where the latrines were located, informed that food would be provided later. Helga and the other women from her unit were assigned to a corner of the barn where other female prisoners had already gathered. There were perhaps 20 women in total, ranging in age from teenagers to grandmothers, most of them auxiliaries like themselves, communications workers, clerks, drivers. A few were nurses, still wearing their distinctive armbands. They regarded each other with wary exhaustion, too overwhelmed by the day's events to do more than exchange basic information about where they had been captured and what units they had served with. As evening fell, American soldiers brought food, bread, some kind of stew, coffee. The portions were not generous, but they were adequate, more than many of the prisoners had eaten in days. Helga took her share and ate mechanically, tasting nothing, her mind still trying to process everything that had happened. Around her, the other prisoners ate in silence or spoke in low murmurs, sharing information, rumors, fears. That night, lying on straw in the barn with a thin blanket that did little to ward off the chill, Helga found herself unable to sleep. Her mind kept returning to that first moment when she had emerged from the bunker and seen the soldiers waiting for her. The disconnect between what she had expected and what she had found was so profound that it felt like a physical thing, a wall that her thoughts kept running into and recoiling from. Everything she had been told, everything she had believed, it had all proven false in a single instant. The soldiers had not been savage, they had not been brutal, they had been professional, even courteous, treating the prisoners with a formality that suggested rules being followed, procedures being observed, and that raised questions that Helga was not ready to confront. If this part of what she had been told was a lie, what else had been lies? If the enemy was not what she had been taught to expect, what did that mean about the cause she had served, about the choices she had made, about the 3 years she had spent working in service of something that now seemed to be crumbling into dust and ashes? She was not alone in her confusion. Around her in the darkness she could hear other women breathing, some crying softly, some whispering prayers or simply lying awake with their thoughts. The nurses were different. They had seen too much, treated too many wounded, heard too many dying words to maintain the illusions that had sustained people like Helga. They lay quietly, almost peacefully, as if capture was simply one more thing to endure in a long series of endurances. The next morning, the 24th of April, began with a light rain that turned the farmyard into a sea of mud. The prisoners were roused at dawn and given more bread and coffee, and then told to assemble in the yard. An American captain addressed them through a translator, informing them that they would be transported to a larger facility where they would remain until decisions could be made about their ultimate disposition. He spoke about the Geneva Conventions, about the rights of prisoners of war, about the rules that would govern their treatment. He made it all sound very organized, very civilized, and Helga found herself wondering if this was propaganda too. American lies to replace German lies, pretty words that would prove hollow in practice. They were loaded onto trucks again, a larger convoy this time, perhaps 200 prisoners divided among a dozen vehicles. The guards were a mix now, she noticed, black soldiers and white soldiers working together, though they did not seem to interact much with each other, maintaining a careful distance that suggested some kind of separation even within their own ranks. This puzzled her. The propaganda had portrayed all Americans as mongrelized and degenerate, mixed together without order or hierarchy. But clearly there were divisions among them, invisible lines that they did not cross. The journey took most of the day, following roads that were crowded with military traffic, moving in both directions, supplies going forward, wounded and prisoners coming back. They passed through towns that had been heavily damaged, buildings reduced to rubble, civilians picking through the wreckage. They passed columns of refugees, people pushing carts loaded with whatever possessions they had managed to save, moving with the aimless desperation of those who had nowhere to go but could not remain where they were. It was a landscape of defeat, of a civilization tearing itself apart, and Helga watched it pass with a growing sense of unreality, as if she were observing events from a great distance, disconnected from the person sitting in the truck experiencing them. The permanent facility was a converted military barracks complex, surrounded by wire fences and guard towers. It was much larger than the temporary processing center, with separate sections for officers and enlisted men, and a smaller section for women. The women's section consisted of 3 barracks buildings, each capable of holding perhaps 50 people, along with a separate building that housed latrines and washing facilities. It was basic but not cruel, the kind of Spartan accommodation that soldiers everywhere would recognize. Helga and her group were assigned to the second barracks, where they found beds with thin mattresses, shelves for personal belongings, and a stove at one end that provided some heat. There were perhaps 40 women already there, and another 20 arrived with Helga's group, filling the building nearly to capacity. A representative from the camp administration, a white American lieutenant accompanied by a German-speaking translator, addressed them that evening, laying out the rules and expectations. They would be expected to keep the barracks clean. They would receive 3 meals a day. They would be required to perform light work details, nothing strenuous, mainly cleaning and maintenance tasks around the camp. They would be allowed to write letters home, though all correspondence would be censored. They would be permitted to hold religious services if they wished to organize them. Medical care would be provided. Any mistreatment by guards should be reported immediately to the camp administration. The speech was formal, almost bureaucratic, and when it was finished, the lieutenant and translator left, and the women were left to sort themselves out, to find beds, to stake out small territories of personal space in the communal living arrangement. Helga chose a bed near the middle of the barracks, not too close to the door where drafts would be coldest, not too far from the stove. She had no belongings to arrange except the clothes she wore and a spare set of undergarments she had been carrying in her pockets. Everything else had been left behind in the rush of capture. That night, lying in a real bed for the first time in months, Helga found that sleep came more easily than it had the night before. Exhaustion overwhelming the churning of her thoughts. She slept deeply and dreamed confused dreams of telegraph keys and thunder and voices speaking in languages she could not understand. The days that followed settled into a routine that was both mind-numbing and oddly comforting. Each morning began at 0600 hours with a wake-up call. They had an hour to wash, dress, and tidy their areas before breakfast was served at 0700. The food was simple but adequate, usually bread, sometimes with a bit of jam or margarine, and coffee or tea. After breakfast, work details were assigned. Helga found herself assigned to a cleaning crew that maintained the administrative buildings, a task that required little thought and less skill, but filled the hours. The work brought her into contact with various members of the camp staff, and here again she found her expectations confounded. The guards were a mix of black and white soldiers, and they treated the prisoners with professional indifference. They were not cruel, but neither were they particularly friendly. They were doing a job, maintaining security, following orders. Some of them were clearly bored, finding prisoner guard duty tedious compared to whatever they had been doing before. Others took their responsibilities seriously, watching the prisoners carefully, alert for any sign of trouble or attempted escape. What struck Helga most was the absence of the violence she had been conditioned to expect. There were no beatings, no abuse, no casual cruelty. When prisoners broke rules, and some did, testing boundaries, seeing what they could get away with, the punishment was isolation or reduction in privileges, not physical harm. When prisoners fell ill, they were taken to the medical facility and treated. When they had complaints, there was a formal procedure for addressing them. It was all so organized, so systematic, so utterly at odds with everything she had been taught about the lawless, savage character of the enemy. Helga was not the only one struggling with this cognitive dissonance. In the evenings, after dinner and before lights out, the women in the barracks would gather in small groups and talk, cautiously at first, and then with increasing openness as the days passed, and they began to trust one another. Some maintained that they were being deceived, that the humane treatment was a temporary show, that the true nature of their captors would eventually emerge. But as days turned into weeks, this position became harder to maintain. Others, particularly the nurses, spoke more openly about what they had witnessed during the war, about the things they had seen and heard that had made them question the official narratives long before capture. One nurse, a woman named Katharina, who had served in field hospitals on the Eastern Front, described treating wounded prisoners, including Soviet soldiers, and finding them to be no different from the German wounded, frightened boys and exhausted men who bled and hurt and died the same way regardless of which uniform they wore. These conversations happened in low voices, careful even in captivity, because the habits of caution ran deep. There were some women in the barracks who remained true believers, who insisted that everything they had been taught was correct and that current circumstances were merely a temporary setback before ultimate victory. These women did not participate in the evening discussions, and the others learned to speak even more quietly when they were nearby. Helga found herself drawn to a small group that included Margaret and Annalisa from her former unit, along with two other women who had been captured near Nuremberg. One was named Gerda, a former bank clerk who had worked in supply management. The other was Ilse, who had been a university student before the war and had served as a translator, fluent in English and French. Ilse was particularly valuable to the group because she could understand at least some of what the guards said among themselves, and she shared occasional insights that helped them make sense of their situation. One evening, perhaps 2 weeks into their captivity, Ilse told them something she had overheard that day. Two guards, both black soldiers, had been talking while Ilse cleaned nearby, apparently not realizing or not caring that she could understand English. They had been discussing the prisoners, commenting on how shocked the German women seemed to be to see black soldiers, how some of the women had clearly expected to be mistreated and were visibly confused by the correct professional treatment they received. One of the guards had laughed, a bitter sound, and said something about how maybe these German women should have seen how black people were treated back home. Then they would not be so surprised to be treated like human beings by black soldiers. Ilse related this conversation carefully, and it hung in the air among the small group, raising questions no one quite knew how to articulate. What did it mean, that comment about treatment back home? Were black soldiers not treated well in their own country? But that made no sense. If they were treated poorly, why would they fight? Why would they be disciplined and professional? The pieces did not fit together into a coherent picture, and the confusion was both frustrating and oddly illuminating, because it suggested that the world was more complicated than any of them had understood. It was Margaret who finally voiced what they were all beginning to think. "Everything we were told was lies," she said quietly. "Everything. From the beginning. All of it." The room fell silent. To say it out loud was to acknowledge something profound and terrifying, that they had been deceived, not just about this one thing or that one thing, but about the fundamental nature of reality. That the entire structure of belief and meaning they had built their lives around was hollow, rotten, false. Around the 3rd week of their captivity, something happened that crystallized everything Helga had been struggling to understand. A work detail was organized to help unload a supply truck that had arrived at the camp. Helga was among the dozen women selected, along with a roughly equal number of male prisoners from the men's section. They were supervised by 3 guards, 2 black soldiers, and 1 white sergeant. The work was simple but physical, carrying crates from the truck to the storage area, a distance of perhaps 50 meters. The crates varied in weight, some light enough that one person could manage them, others requiring 2 people to lift. They worked steadily for perhaps an hour, and then one of the women, Frida from Helga's original unit, stumbled and fell, dropping her end of a crate she had been helping to carry. The crate hit the ground hard and split open, spilling out its contents. Cans of food, bags of flour, other supplies. Frida lay on the ground where she had fallen, making no effort to rise, and Helga realized with a shock that she was weeping, great racking sobs that shook her entire body. The guards converged immediately, the 2 black soldiers reaching Frida first. One of them knelt beside her, speaking in German with his heavy accent. "Are you hurt? Did you injure yourself in the fall?" Frida just shook her head, unable to speak through her tears. The guard looked up at his companion, clearly uncertain how to proceed, and then looked over at Helga. "Can you help her?" he asked. "Find out what is wrong?" Helga knelt beside Frida and put a hand on her shoulder. "Frida," she said gently. "Frida, tell me what is wrong. Are you hurt?" It took several minutes before Frida could speak coherently. When she finally did, the words came in a rush. "I cannot do this anymore," she said. "I cannot keep pretending that I do not see what I see, that I do not understand what I understand. We were told that they were animals, monsters. And look at them. Look at how they treat us, with more humanity than we were ever taught to show them, with more decency than we showed our own people if they were different or weak or questioned anything. How can I live with what I believed? How can I live with what I was part of? The guards did not understand all of this. Frida was speaking in rapid, emotional German, but they understood enough to recognize a breakdown when they saw one. One of them went to get the camp medic while the other stayed, maintaining a respectful distance, his rifle pointed at the ground, his expression showing what might have been sympathy. When the medic arrived, a white American lieutenant who spoke passable German, he examined Frida briefly, determined that she was physically unharmed, and had her taken to the infirmary for rest and observation. The work detail continued, but something had changed. The prisoners worked more slowly, more thoughtfully, each of them processing what they had witnessed. And the guards, at least the two black soldiers, seemed to understand something of what had happened. They were quieter, less talkative among themselves, as if Frida's breakdown had reminded them of something they preferred not to think about too directly. That evening, back in the barracks, the women gathered around Frida's bed and tried to offer what comfort they could. Frida was calmer now, exhausted by her emotional outburst, but when she spoke, her voice was clear and steady. "I cannot unsee it," she said. "I cannot go back to believing what I believed before. And I do not know what to do with that. I do not know how to be a person who was so wrong about something so fundamental." Hannelise, who had been silent through most of the women's evening conversations since capture, finally spoke. "My husband," she said quietly, "died believing in something that was a lie. He went to the Eastern Front and never came back, and he died believing he was fighting for something noble and right and necessary. And now I know that he died for nothing, for lies, for evil dressed up as virtue. And I do not know if that makes his death more tragic or less meaningful, or what it means for me, for how I'm supposed to remember him." She took out the photograph she always carried, the one she looked at in private moments, and held it up so the others could see. "He was a good man," she said, "kind and funny and decent. He would not have gone if he had known. He would not have fought. And they took him and they filled his head with lies and they sent him east and he never came back, and I will never forgive them for that. I will never forgive myself for not seeing through the lies sooner, for not trying to stop him." The confessions opened a floodgate. Other women began to speak, tentatively at first and then more openly, about their doubts, their questions, the moments when they had wondered if perhaps things were not as they were being told. Margaret talked about being a teacher, about the textbooks she had been required to use, the lessons she had been forced to teach, and how even at the time she had felt a sick unease about some of the material, but had told herself that her discomfort was her own weakness, her own failure to understand the larger truths that more educated people than her had discerned. Ilse spoke about the university, about professors who had been dismissed or who had simply disappeared, about books that had been removed from the library, about the gradual narrowing of what could be discussed, what could be questioned, until the intellectual life of the institution had been strangled. She had dropped out in 1942 and joined the auxiliaries because it had seemed like a way to escape the suffocating atmosphere. But of course, she had only exchanged one form of confinement for another. Helga found herself speaking too, about her parents, about the postal clerk father and seamstress mother, who had raised her to be obedient and dutiful, who had been so proud when she joined the auxiliaries, who had believed every word of the official pronouncements because they were decent people who could not imagine that their leaders would lie to them about matters of life and death. She wondered where they were now, whether they were safe, whether they were grappling with the same awful revelations she was facing. The conversation continued late into the night, long past lights out, conducted in whispers and murmurs, and it marked a turning point for the women in that barracks. They had begun the process of confronting what they had been part of acknowledging the weight of their complicity, however unknowing. It was painful and difficult and incomplete. They were still just beginning to understand the full scope of what they had been deceived about, but it was necessary, a first step toward some kind of reckoning with themselves. In the days that followed, Helga found herself paying closer attention to the black soldiers who guarded the camp and supervised the work details. She was trying to understand something that still eluded her full comprehension, how men who had been portrayed as barely human could exhibit such discipline, such professionalism, such fundamental human decency. She watched how they interacted with each other, the camaraderie and the tensions, the informal hierarchies and friendships. She watched how they dealt with the prisoners, maintaining authority without cruelty, enforcing rules without vindictiveness. One of the guards, a corporal named Jackson, Helga learned his name from his uniform tag, seemed particularly thoughtful, more introspective than many of the others. He was a man of perhaps 25 years, medium height and build, with a quiet manner and eyes that suggested he saw more than he said. He was often assigned to supervise work details, and Helga noticed that he had a gift for explaining tasks clearly, for organizing work efficiently, for motivating without resorting to threats or punishment. One day, during a break in a work detail, Helga found herself near Jackson as he sat on a crate, drinking water from his canteen. Emboldened by several weeks of captivity and the gradual realization that her guards were not going to harm her for asking questions, she approached him and asked in her limited English if she could speak with him. He looked surprised, but gestured for her to sit on a nearby crate. Her English was poor and his German was minimal, so the conversation was halting and difficult, but they managed. She asked him where he was from and he said Mississippi, a word that meant nothing to her. She asked how long he had been in the war, and he said 2 years. She asked if he missed home, and something flickered in his eyes, something complicated and painful, and he said yes, but home was complicated, not simple. She wanted to ask more, wanted to understand the bitterness she had heard in that comment, but her English was not adequate to frame the question properly. Instead, she asked something simpler. Why are you kind to us? We were your enemy. You could treat us badly, and no one would stop you. Why do you not? Jackson looked at her for a long moment, as if trying to decide how to answer, or whether to answer at all. Finally, he said in slow, careful German that he must have been practicing, because someone has to break the cycle. Because cruelty answered with cruelty just makes more cruelty. Because you are prisoners, not animals. Because I will not become the monster other people think I am, just because they gave me the chance. Helga did not fully understand all the words, but she understood the sentiment, and it struck her with almost physical force. Here was a man who had every reason to be bitter, who had undoubtedly faced his own share of injustice and prejudice, and he had chosen to respond with humanity rather than revenge. It was a lesson she had not expected to learn from an enemy, from a man she had been taught to despise and fear. The conversation ended when the break ended, and they returned to work. But Helga found herself thinking about it for days afterward. She mentioned it to her small group of friends during one of their evening conversations, and Ilse nodded thoughtfully. I have been listening to the guards talk, she said. The black soldiers, I mean, and I am beginning to understand something about them, about their situation. They are fighting for their own country, but that country does not treat them as equals. They serve in separate units, eat in separate facilities, are not allowed in many places that white soldiers can go. And yet they fight anyway, with discipline and courage, because they believe that service might earn them the respect and equality they deserve. It is complicated and sad and admirable all at once. This information circulated through the group, and it added another layer to their understanding. The world was not simple, not divided into clear categories of good and evil, victor and vanquished, us and them. The world was complex and contradictory, full of ironies and injustices on all sides, and the only way to navigate it was to insist on treating individual human beings as human beings, regardless of what category they fell into or what uniform they wore. As April turned into May, news filtered into the camp about the larger events of the war. The camp administration did not make any formal announcements, but rumors spread through the prisoner population carried by new arrivals, by guards who let things slip, by those who could read English and saw newspapers that were sometimes left lying around. The war in Europe had ended, they heard. Total surrender had been declared. The government in Berlin had collapsed. The cities were in ruins. Millions were dead. The full scope of the defeat was almost incomprehensible. But there was other news too, more disturbing news. That began to filter in. News about camps that had been discovered as the Allied forces advanced eastward. Not prisoner-of-war camps like the one Helga was in, but something else entirely. something that defied immediate comprehension. Camps where people had been murdered on an industrial scale, where the regime Helga had served had committed acts of such profound evil that even the rumors seemed unbelievable. At first, many of the prisoners dismissed these reports as enemy propaganda, as exaggerations designed to justify the Allied victory and demonize the defeated. But the reports kept coming, and they included details that were too specific, too consistent to be merely fabricated. Photographs were shown to some of the prisoners, images so horrifying that those who saw them often could not speak afterward, could only weep or stare in stunned silence. Film footage was shown in some camps, documentary evidence that could not be explained away or dismissed. And gradually, terribly, the prisoners were forced to confront not just that they had been deceived about the enemy, but that they had been serving something far darker than they had imagined, something that had committed crimes against humanity that would stain history forever. Helga heard about the photographs and footage second-hand. Her camp did not show them to the women prisoners, but she heard enough to understand the essential truth. The regime she had served had been evil, not in the abstract way that all war is evil, but in a deliberate, systematic, genocidal way that targeted specific groups of people for extermination. She had not known about this while it was happening. None of the women in her barracks had known, or if they had heard rumors, they had dismissed them as impossible, as enemy propaganda, as the kind of atrocity stories that circulate in every war, but not knowing did not absolve her. She had been part of the machinery, a small cog perhaps, transmitting messages and maintaining communications, but still part of the system that had made such horrors possible. She had believed when she should have questioned. She had obeyed when she should have resisted. She had accepted comfortable lies when the truth was available to anyone willing to look for it, to think critically, to maintain some independent moral judgment. The weight of this realization was crushing. In the barracks, the conversations changed character. There was less discussion about personal experiences and more about complicity, about guilt, about how to live with the knowledge of what they had been part of. Some of the women refused to believe, insisted that the reports were false, that the victors were simply demonizing the defeated, as victors always did. But these women were fewer now, and their denial sounded increasingly hollow, increasingly desperate. Others, like Helga, struggled with questions that had no easy answers. What did it mean to have served evil without knowing it was evil? Were intentions meaningless if the results were so catastrophic? Could one be forgiven for complicity based on ignorance? And even if forgiveness were possible, how did one forgive oneself? How did one construct a life afterward, knowing what one had been part of? There were no good answers to these questions, no resolution that would ease the pain or lift the burden. But the conversations themselves mattered, the willingness to confront these questions rather than avoid them. It was a beginning, however inadequate, of the moral reckoning that would be necessary if there was to be any hope of moving forward, of building something better from the ashes of total defeat. Throughout this difficult period, the guards maintained their professional distance, but Helga noticed that some of them, particularly the black soldiers, seemed to watch the prisoners with something that might have been sympathy, as if they recognized in the prisoners' struggle with guilt and complicity an echo of their own struggles with a different set of injustices. There was no explicit acknowledgement of this connection, no conversations about it, but there were small gestures, a kind word, a cigarette shared, a moment of eye contact that conveyed understanding. Jackson, the thoughtful corporal Helga had spoken with, was rotated out of the camp in mid-May, replaced by other guards. Helga never saw him again, but she thought about him often, about what he had said about breaking cycles of cruelty, about refusing to become the monster that others expected. It struck her that this was perhaps the only path forward, to refuse the easy comfort of victimhood or denial, to insist on maintaining one's own humanity even in circumstances that tempted one toward bitterness or despair. By June, the camp population had swelled as more prisoners were brought in from other temporary facilities. The women's section now held nearly 200 women, and new barracks had been constructed to accommodate them. The routine remained much the same: work details during the day, simple meals, evening hours for personal time and conversation. But there was a growing sense of impermanence, a feeling that this was a temporary situation awaiting some kind of resolution. Rumors circulated about what would happen to them. Some said they would be released soon, allowed to return to their homes if they had homes to return to. Others said they would be sent to work in factories or farms to help with reconstruction. Still others spoke fearfully of trials, of punishment for their service. No one knew for certain, and the camp administration provided no information beyond assurances that everyone would be treated according to international law. In late June, Red Cross representatives visited the camp, conducting interviews with prisoners and inspecting conditions. They spoke with Helga and many of the other women, asking about their treatment, their health, their understanding of what would happen to them. The representatives seemed satisfied with what they found. The conditions were Spartan but adequate. The treatment was humane. The rules were applied fairly. They left behind packages of small comforts, sewing supplies, writing paper, books in German, simple games. Helga used some of the writing paper to compose a letter to her parents, though she had no idea if they would ever receive it, had no idea where they were, or even if they were still alive. She wrote carefully, choosing her words with precision, trying to convey something of what she had experienced and learned without overwhelming them or putting herself at risk if the letter was read by censors. She wrote about being captured, about being treated humanely despite her fears. She wrote about learning that many of the things they had all believed were false. She wrote about trying to understand how to live with this knowledge, how to be a person who had made such terrible mistakes in judgment. She ended by saying she hoped they were safe, that she loved them, that perhaps someday they could be together again and try to make sense of everything that had happened. She never knew if her parents received the letter. Years later, after she was released and made it back to Munich, she learned that her father had died of illness in March of 1945, before the war ended, still believing in ultimate victory. Her mother had survived barely, living in the ruins of their old neighborhood. When Helga finally reunited with her, they spoke carefully around the most difficult subjects, but her mother eventually told her that yes, she had received the letter, and yes, it had helped her understand some of what Helga had experienced. It had not been enough to bridge all the gaps between them, but it had been a start. In July, the first groups of prisoners began to be released. The process was gradual and apparently based on some criteria that were not fully explained, perhaps available documentation of minimal involvement, perhaps pragmatic decisions about age or health or skills needed for reconstruction. The women in Helga's barracks watched as some of their number were called out, processed and sent away to uncertain futures. Each departure was bittersweet. Happiness for those released mixed with anxiety for those who remained, wondering when or if their own turn would come. Margaret was released in mid-July. She had been designated low priority for prosecution because of her age and her role as a teacher before the war, and there was apparently a need for teachers to help with children who had been displaced or orphaned. She said goodbye to Helga and the others with tears in her eyes, extracting promises that they would try to find each other after everything was settled, knowing even as she made these promises that the world was too chaotic and uncertain for such reunions to be likely. Anneliese left in early August, released to return to her hometown where she had family who could take her in. She gave Helga her husband's photograph before she left, saying that she did not need it anymore, that she had finally made peace with his memory and could let it go. Helga tried to refuse, but Anneliese insisted. "Remember him," she said, "not as a soldier for a bad cause, but as a good man who was deceived. Remember that good people can be led into terrible things if they are not vigilant, if they do not question, if they trust too easily in authority. And then do better. Be better. That is how we honor the dead, by learning from their mistakes and ours." Ilse and Gerda left together in mid-August, both being sent to a processing center for former auxiliaries who might have skills useful in the occupation administration. Ilse's language abilities and Gerda's administrative experience made them valuable for the enormous task of rebuilding civil society. They were nervous about what awaited them, but also quietly relieved to have some prospect of meaningful work, some way to contribute to reconstruction rather than destruction. By late August, only about 40 women remained in what had once held 200. Helga was among them, though she did not know why her release had been delayed. She continued with the work details, maintaining the routines that had structured her days for months. She had grown thinner, harder, more reflective. The scared 23-year-old girl who had emerged from a bunker with her hands up in April had been replaced by a young woman who had confronted terrible truths about herself and her country and was trying to figure out how to build a life in the aftermath of such revelations. On September 5, 1945, exactly 4 months and 12 days after her capture, Helga was called to the administration building and told that she was being released. She would be provided with papers documenting her status as a former prisoner of war, given a small amount of currency, and transported to the nearest functioning railway station. From there, she would be on her own. The American lieutenant who processed her paperwork was perfunctory but not unkind. He advised her to register with local authorities wherever she ended up, to carry her papers at all times, to avoid discussing her service in the war. Then he had a guard escort her to a truck waiting outside the compound. As Helga walked through the camp gates for the last time, she found herself looking back at the barracks where she had spent 4 months, at the guards in their towers, at the fence that had defined the boundaries of her world for so long. One of the guards watching her depart was a black soldier, and though she did not know him, so many guards had rotated through the camp that she had stopped learning their names. She found herself raising a hand in a tentative wave. The guard nodded back, a simple acknowledgement, a soldier seeing off a former enemy, nothing more or less. The truck took her to a railway station that was crowded with refugees and displaced persons, all trying to get somewhere, to find family, to locate some remnant of the lives they had known before. Helga joined a line for tickets, using her carefully hoarded currency to buy passage to Munich. The train, when it finally arrived, was packed far beyond capacity. People jammed into every available space, sitting on floors and hanging from doorways. Helga squeezed into a corner and held on as the train lurched into motion, beginning the long, slow journey toward a city that had once been her home and might be again if anything was left of it. The journey took 2 days because the tracks were damaged in many places and the train had to take long detours. Helga spent those 2 days in a kind of suspended animation, too exhausted to think much about what awaited her, focused entirely on the immediate challenges of enduring the crowded, uncomfortable conditions. She shared what little food she had with others in her compartment, and they shared with her in turn, a small community of displaced people helping each other through difficult circumstances. When the train finally pulled into Munich, or what was left of Munich, Helga almost did not recognize the city. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble. Buildings she remembered from her childhood were simply gone. The streets were filled with people picking through ruins, searching for anything salvageable. Living in cellars and improvised shelters, she made her way through this landscape of devastation, following half-remembered routes, until she reached the neighborhood where she had grown up. Her parents' building was damaged, but still partially standing. The ground floor was intact, though the upper floors had been destroyed by fire. She climbed the stairs with her heart pounding, not knowing what she would find, and knocked on the door of what had been her family's apartment. A long silence, and then the door opened a crack, and her mother's face appeared, older than Helga remembered, thinner, marked by suffering, but alive, miraculously alive. They fell into each other's arms and wept, her mother asking questions faster than Helga could answer them, pulling her inside, fussing over how thin she had gotten, how worn she looked. It was only later, after the initial reunion, after some food and washing and rest, that her mother told her about her father's death, about the final months of the war in Munich, about the occupation and the difficult present they now had to navigate. And it was only then, sitting in the ruins of her childhood home, that Helga told her mother the full story of her captivity, of the black soldiers who had treated her with humanity when she had expected brutality, of the lies she had believed and the truths she had learned, of the profound reckoning she had undergone with who she had been and who she might become. Her mother listened without interrupting, and when Helga finished, she was quiet for a long time before speaking. "I am glad you learned these things," her mother said finally. "I wish you had not had to learn them the way you did, at such cost, but I am glad you learned them. Now the question is what you do with this knowledge, how you live going forward, whether you become bitter or whether you become better." It was the same thing Annalisa had said, Helga realized. The same challenge that Jackson the corporal had articulated in his own way. The choice to break cycles rather than perpetuate them. The decision to insist on humanity in circumstances that tempted one toward cruelty or despair. It was not an easy path. Nothing about the years that followed would be easy, but it was the only path that offered any hope of redemption, any possibility of building something better from the ashes of catastrophic failure. Helga found work eventually, first as a clerk in a supply office run by the occupation authorities, later as a translator as her English improved. She reconnected with some of the women from the camp, not all, but enough to maintain friendships that would last decades. They never spoke directly about the most painful aspects of their shared experience, but they did not need to. The bond created by having confronted those terrible truths together was stronger than any words could express. She never married, though she had opportunities. Something in her had been too profoundly shaken by the war and its aftermath to commit to the kind of settled domestic life that marriage represented. Instead, she built a life around her work, her friendships, and a quiet determination to be someone who questioned rather than blindly accepted, who thought critically rather than simply obeyed, who maintained some independent moral compass regardless of what authorities or popular opinion might dictate. In the 1960s, when Helga was in her 40s, she attended a lecture series about the American Civil Rights Movement, curious about what had happened in the country whose soldiers had been her captors and, in their own way, her teachers. She learned about segregation, about the systematic oppression that Black Americans had faced and continued to face, about the irony of men fighting for freedom abroad while being denied basic rights at home. And she understood, finally, the full meaning of what Jackson had said to her that day during the work detail, about home being complicated, about refusing to become the monster others expected. She wondered what had happened to Jackson, whether he had made it home safely, whether he had found the respect and equality he deserved, whether he had been able to maintain his humanity in the face of whatever disappointments and injustices he had encountered. She would never know. She had only his first name and a vague memory of his face, but she thought about him sometimes, and about the other black soldiers who had guarded the camp, and she felt a profound gratitude, mixed with sadness that such men had been required to exhibit such dignity and restraint when they had every reason to be angry and bitter. In the 1970s, as Germany grappled with its past in new and more honest ways, Helga participated in some of the discussions about collective memory and responsibility. She spoke at a few educational events, always carefully, always emphasizing the dangers of believing comfortable lies, of failing to question authority, of allowing prejudice to override basic human decency. She did not present herself as heroic or particularly wise. She had been foolish and complicit, and she never tried to pretend otherwise. But she could speak as someone who had undergone a transformation, who had learned hard lessons and tried to apply them. She lived into her 80s, dying in 2004, having witnessed Germany's reunification and its emergence as a stable democracy, committed to never repeating the mistakes of the past. In her final years, she sometimes wondered if the lessons she had learned, that her generation had learned at such terrible cost, would survive into future generations, or whether each generation would have to learn them anew. She hoped for the former but feared the latter, knowing how easy it is to forget, how tempting it is to believe simple narratives that divide the world into us and them, how comfortable prejudice can be when it confirms what we already want to believe. The story of Helga Schneider and the women in that prisoner of war camp is not unique. Thousands of similar stories played out across Germany in the final months of the war and the years that followed as people confronted the gap between what they had believed and what was true, as they grappled with their complicity in a system that had committed unprecedented evil. Not all of them faced these truths as honestly as Helga and her companions did. Many chose denial. Many rewrote their own histories to minimize their involvement. Many spent the rest of their lives insisting that they had known nothing, done nothing, been innocent bystanders in a catastrophe they bore no responsibility for. But some did face the truth, did undergo genuine transformation, did commit themselves to being better, to building something better. And often, paradoxically, this transformation was catalyzed by encounters with the very people they had been taught to hate and fear, by discovering that those labeled as enemies or inferiors were, in fact, human beings worthy of respect and capable of exhibiting virtues that put their supposed superiors to shame. The black American soldiers who served in World War II have their own stories. Stories of serving a country that did not treat them as equals, of fighting for freedoms abroad that they were denied at home, of maintaining discipline and professionalism in the face of both enemy opposition and domestic prejudice. Many of them returned home after the war to find that their service had not earned them the respect they deserved, that the society they had fought for was not ready to change. The civil rights movement that would eventually bring about real change was still years in the future, and it would require immense courage and sacrifice from people who had already given so much. But in the small interactions between these soldiers and their German prisoners, in moments like the conversation between Helga and Corporal Jackson, in the daily demonstrations of humanity and professionalism despite every reason to be otherwise, something important happened. Cycles of hatred were interrupted, prejudices were challenged, human connections were made across lines that were supposed to be uncrossable. It was not enough. It could never be enough to undo the immense harm that had been done or to solve the systemic injustices that persisted. But it was something. It was a reminder that individual human beings always have choices about how they treat other human beings, regardless of what larger systems or ideologies might dictate. The lesson that Helga learned in that prisoner of war camp, that everything she had been told about her enemies was a lie, that prejudice is not just wrong, but actively obscures reality, that humanity must be recognized and respected, regardless of race or nationality or any other category, is a lesson that every generation must learn anew. It is not a lesson that can be taught through abstract lectures or moral pronouncements. It must be learned through experience, through direct contact with those we have been taught to fear or despise, through the shock of discovering that our assumptions are wrong and that the world is more complex and more human than our simplistic narratives allowed. The historical record is full of such moments, instances where enemies became human to each other, where hatred gave way to understanding, where the machinery of war and oppression could not entirely suppress basic human decency. These moments do not erase the larger crimes and injustices. Nothing can do that. But they suggest possibilities, paths forward, ways of being human that do not require perpetual cycles of revenge and cruelty. For Helga and the women like her, the confrontation with these truths was painful and disorienting, a shattering of their entire worldview that left them struggling to reconstruct some kind of meaningful existence from the fragments. But it was also necessary, the beginning of a moral reckoning that Germany as a nation would have to undertake if it was to move forward, to build a democratic society, to earn its place again among civilized nations. Not everyone was capable of this reckoning, not everyone was willing, but enough people were, and that made the difference between a country that remained mired in denial and resentment and a country that could honestly examine its past and commit to doing better. The black soldiers who served as guards in these prisoner of war camps were, in their own way, performing a similar kind of moral work. They could have used their positions to exact revenge, to return cruelty for cruelty, to demonstrate that they were capable of the savagery they had been accused of. The fact that they did not, that they maintained their professionalism and humanity even when it would have been easy and perhaps understandable to do otherwise, speaks to a kind of moral courage that often goes unrecognized. They were representatives of a country that had not always treated them justly, enforcing rules on behalf of a system that was flawed and incomplete. And yet, they did their duty with honor, because they understood something that their prisoners were just beginning to learn, that maintaining one's own humanity is not conditional on how others treat you, that choosing decency over cruelty is always possible even in the most difficult circumstances, that the only way to build a better world is to insist on being better yourself, regardless of whether others reciprocate. This is not a simple or comfortable message. It does not resolve the very real problems of injustice and oppression with easy answers. It does not suggest that individual goodness is sufficient to overcome systemic evil, but it does suggest that individual choices matter, that small acts of humanity can ripple outward in unexpected ways. that the refusal to perpetuate cycles of cruelty is both morally necessary and practically important. It suggests that even in the darkest moments, even in situations that seem to offer no good choices, there is still the choice of how we treat the individual human beings we encounter, and that choice always matters. The day that Helga Schneider emerged from that bunker and saw Black American soldiers for the first time was a day that changed her life. It was the day that everything she thought she knew proved to be false. The day that her carefully constructed worldview collapsed. The day that she began the painful process of learning to see reality clearly, rather than through the distorting lens of propaganda and prejudice. It was not a comfortable transformation. It did not happen all at once. It required months and years of reflection, of confronting difficult truths, of learning to live with the knowledge of her own complicity in evil. But it was also, in its own way, a kind of liberation. To be freed from lies, even when those lies had been comfortable and familiar, is to gain the possibility of living authentically, of making real choices based on real understanding rather than simply following the path laid out by others. Helga's life after the war was not easy. Few lives were easy in those years, but it was her own, built on foundations of hard-won understanding rather than unexamined assumptions. She made mistakes, certainly. She carried guilt for the rest of her life, wondering if there had been moments during the war when she could have questioned more, resisted more, seen through the lies sooner. But she also lived with integrity, with honesty about her past and her failures, and with a commitment to being better than she had been. And that perhaps is the ultimate lesson of her story and the stories of countless others like her. We all carry the capacity for both good and evil. We can all be deceived by propaganda, misled by prejudice, complicit in systems we do not fully understand. But we also all carry the capacity for transformation, for learning, for recognizing when we have been wrong, and choosing to do better. The question is whether we will exercise that capacity, whether we will face uncomfortable truths rather than retreat into comfortable denial, whether we will insist on treating others with humanity, even when it would be easier or more profitable to do otherwise. The Black American soldiers who guarded that prisoner of war camp made their choice. They chose professionalism over revenge, humanity over cruelty, discipline over chaos. Helga Schneider and her companions eventually made their choice too. They chose to confront the truth of what they had been part of rather than hide from it, to accept responsibility rather than claim victimhood, to commit to being better rather than simply being bitter. These were not easy choices. They were not complete choices. No human choice ever completely resolves the moral complexities we face. But they were meaningful choices, choices that mattered, choices that made the people who made them more fully human. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.